The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to John Poland, member of the advisory board for 21st Century Democrats. He's also a political consultant who has managed numerous campaigns and has served as an official with the Texas Democratic Party. John Poland, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure. And American Family Voices and 21st Century Democrats just released a new report that seeks to understand Democratic losses in factory towns. For the purpose of this report, how do you define factory towns?
It's really the places that have been left out of the discussion. It's not the big urban centers, it's not the suburban towns, and it's not the purely rural counties, but it's the counties with cities of mid-sized factory towns would be 35,000 or more population, where most folks in that community are not engaged in agriculture production directly and not truly a rural county.
Now, to quote the report, Democrats have been hemorrhaging millions of votes in these communities. How significant are these losses in terms of being able to win elections as we move forward?
It's the difference between winning elections handily or winning very close elections, as in 2020, or the difference between winning and losing, as in 2016. But more importantly, it's also the difference between winning some Senate seats in some states that have heretofore elected a good number of Democrats, states like Ohio and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the report explores a number of factors to explain the decline in Democratic voting in factory towns. One is the decline in manufacturing jobs. And I know there are a lot of reasons behind this, and a lot of it's debated, but how does this trend out, or how does it play out politically?
Well, the efforts that are being currently undertaken by the Democratic administration, President Biden, and the Democratic Senate and House will drive manufacturing jobs, an increase in manufacturing jobs around the new energy, for instance, issues that we face. So a good example is Toledo in Ohio. Right outside of Toledo, there's a company that's building solar panels to compete with the Chinese. I think if we learn nothing else from the pandemic, it is that the supply chain is easily interrupted, and we need to make sure that services and products that are essential to America's well-being are manufactured here. So that stimulus is going to produce more of these jobs, and more of these jobs are going to be coming to factory towns like those around Toledo.
Is that a key to getting back that populist vote by creating these new types of manufacturing jobs that kind of take us further into the 21st century where we should be headed anyway?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And no one is suggesting that all the folks who get these jobs are going to return to the Democratic fold. There'll be people who will continue to vote as their primary issue on destroying the public school system and not on their economic well-being. But the more people who have good paying jobs that are, an honest day's work produces a good living standard for them and their family, they're going to be more responsive to a Democratic message, and there'll be some votes that will be gained through that. And that's our objective here, is to reduce the losses we've been suffering in turn around the direction that has driven the party to virtually no existence in many of these small factory towns and mid-sized factory towns.
Mm-hmm. And we're speaking to John Poland, member of the advisory board for 21st Century Democrats. He's a political consultant who has managed numerous campaigns and has served as an official with the Texas Democratic Party. John, you also explored declining union rates, and this has been going on for many, many years now. What's the political impact when union jobs leave a community?
Well, unions are not just the entity that's going to best represent workers in their fights for a fair and livable wage, but unions also provide information to their members that is outside the very narrow echo chamber that many of these smaller communities operate under, where the only source of information they get is between Fox News and maybe their employer. And if their employer is an active member of the U.S. Chamber, and that's essentially a Republican organization, and they're going to be parroting the Republican talking points on everything. We need to have a voice in these communities that represents the workers, and this gives another point of view. And we believe that the rise in union participation, union membership, will provide that type of an organization.
In terms of political strategy, what should Democrats be doing to win over, or even, I'd say, win back factory town voters?
Well, I think the first and foremost is showing up. We just haven't been present in most of these communities. These communities only hear from their employers and only hear from the Republican Party and only hear from the right-wing media echo chamber. Showing up is the first thing you've got to do. You're not going to make any progress until you do. So showing up, participating locally, organizing, putting out a message of hope and opportunity that these new jobs, manufacturing jobs, are going to be creating, and getting people to start talking about issues that are really focused on their economic well-being and their families' well-being and the future. Their children's future, their children's education, their children's ability to live and work in the community they were raised in, should they choose to do so.
Mm-hmm. All right. John Poland, member of the advisory board for 21st Century Democrats, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. John, we appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you. Love to join.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Equal justice under law. That's the noble principle carved into the marble facade of the Supreme Court building. Today, though, 6 right-wing corporate-dominated activist judges control the present court, and they're implementing an elitist creed mocking that ideal. By putting the interests and power of the wealthy over the rest of us, they're turning justice into an anti-democratic concept of just us. In ruling after ruling, today's Supremes are political operatives taking power from the many to further empower and enrich the few. One huge change occurred in 2010 when the 5 Republican judges decreed that corporations be given a constitutional right to spend unlimited sums of their cash to dominate our elections and to pack our courts with judges who serve them. Sure enough, a majority of Supremes are now in harness to the corporate agenda. Consider their constant push to rig the rules against workers. While the federal judiciary has aided corporate bosses for decades by chipping away at hard-won legal protections for working families, the chisel has become a jackhammer in the last few years. The Supreme Court's Republican majority routinely pounds precedents, logic, truth, and the Constitution itself to demolish the structural pillars of labor rights and organizing. In a 2018 case, for example, the GOP judges undermined the funding of unions by arbitrarily striking down their process for collecting dues, a practice the court itself had authorized 41 years earlier. As Justice Elena Kagan bluntly put it, there was no reason for the court to barge into this matter of long-settled law, except that the Republican majority simply didn't like the previous decision and overruled it, quote, because it wanted to. This is Jim Hightower saying, this is not justice, it's raw politics by black-robed partisans supplanting America's hallowed rule of law with their own anti-labor whim. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
But our pleasure to have you with us. You've been writing and talking about rebuilding American manufacturing for some time now, and recently you've noted that during this pandemic, the decline in American manufacturing has actually put the nation at risk. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think manufacturing has been struggling for a long time as a result of free trade agreements, about an effort to offshore work, people literally just chasing a cheaper labor cost and a place to operate without environmental rules. And we've seen that hollow out a lot of jobs in a lot of communities. And we've lost, by some estimates, nearly 6 million jobs in the manufacturing sector over the last decade. But I think when this pandemic hit, people realized that America could no longer even produce its own sort of safety gear. We had to scramble to try and get masks from Asia and gowns and ventilators, and that industry had largely been offshored. And so we had all the states having to look to Asia. They got in a bidding war amongst themselves, and for 2 months, we really struggled to figure out where are we going to get the stuff we need to deal with the healthcare concerns going on in this. And I think that has been eye-opening for people, as it should be. And so the country's supply chain needs to be reliable. And there's certainly a market for those products here because they're coming in from offshore. They ought to be done here. And we ought to know who's making those kind of things and who's making whatever products we may need in the U.S. And so they're easily accessible. We know what the quality is, and we know that we can get it when we need it. And, sort of just quit chasing the cheapest price we can get out of anything.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've also been speaking out about our nation's failure to invest in infrastructure. How do you see that failure playing out in American lives right now?
2 weeks ago in Midland, Michigan, 2 dams failed. And flooded entire communities, wiped them out, homes under 25 foot of water. But those dams and the risk associated with them and their condition had been known for years and years, 20 years, but nothing was done about it. And we keep trying to rely on an infrastructure and bridges that the engineers, the organization of engineers who rate America's bridges, rate our bridge system in the U.S. at a D+. We leak 1 trillion gallons of fresh water a year in the country because our water systems and our piping systems are old and decaying. And you just can't allow that to happen to your infrastructure. And, look, Americans have a lot of common sense. If you never changed the oil in your car, or if you didn't do minor maintenance, or if you didn't take care of your home, it eventually is going to fail on you. And America is sort of running to fail on its infrastructure, and it's going to take a big investment. And at a time like this, when the country is trying to figure out, all right, we now have 40 million people out of work, and some will go back to work, but a lot won't. There's a lot that's changed in this economy, in this pandemic, when you look out over the horizon. So a big infrastructure investment that puts people to work, that does training, that has a long-term scope to it, is the kind of shot in the arm we need. And it's a minimum of $1 trillion investment, but it's an investment for our future that we have to make, or the country is just going to be so inefficient and so enabled to meet its own needs. So, look, infrastructure it builds a manufacturing supply chain. It has upstream and downstream possibilities that come with it, and it put a lot of people to work. And it's not just bridges and roads. It's a broadband system. It's a new electrical grid that doesn't have 8 and 9% of yield drop across of it. There's a fiber optic system that constantly needs to be installed. I mean, there's all kinds of work to do, and we just aren't doing it in any systematic way or any planned way.
Well, and you've written that an infrastructure campaign is more essential now than ever. But what would it actually look like? If you were going to draw all that up, what would that look like?
Look, there's a lot of different components to it, and infrastructure isn't one thing. It's sort of a review of our transportation systems, our rail systems, building electric buses and electric trains in the U.S., making sure our interstate systems are repaired and operating right, making sure our electric grid works, our water systems work, that our gas systems aren't leaking methane. If I often thought if I could get with a bunch of companies who make appliances and then with the service providers in each area who are gas and electric companies, and couple them together and have them train teams of people who could go into each home and outfit each home with high energy, 5-star efficiency appliances, hot water heaters, dryers, washers, kitchen appliances, furnaces, and train people to do sort of house sealing, caulking, windows. You could train an army of people. You could find a way to pay for those things initially through seed money through the government with a long-term payback on people's monthly bill. And the money that we would save in energy loss and yield drop and leakage in every home would be tremendous. This is a project that could go on for 20 or 30 years, and we would build skills into a group of people who are going to need jobs, and these are good, skilled jobs. I mean, there are ways to do this if people want to set their mind to it and incubate a system like that.
Yeah, and as you said, and it's creating additional jobs, newer jobs as well. We're speaking with Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union. And Tom, some people have said that if and when we emerge from this pandemic, and Lord knows we hope we all do, there will be an opportunity for America to reinvent itself. Assuming that is true, what is it you would like to see in terms of how we approach manufacturing?
Look, on manufacturing, we have to decide we're no longer going to rely on Asia, on places that the only advantage they have is to take advantage of either their peoples or just create things in a non-sustainable way. So if you've got, a country like China who's making steel, for example, and they're putting 3.5 or 4 or multiple 3.5, 4 tons of carbon into the air as opposed to making that steel here, then I think that's a consideration people need to take a look at. And it's not just price, because you don't get something cheap for no reason. And we need a policy in America that looks at our manufacturing and isn't just leave it all to the market. And this sort of, the economists are out there saying, well, this is all just the invisible hand of the market. The market does what the market wants to. That's just not true. This is not God created. These are a function of laws that are created by lobbyists and lawyers and corporations who want to take this work offshore because they're doing an arbitrage on labor, on the climate, on sustainability, and that's the margin they're making their money off of. And that's not a competitive advantage. They're creating that advantage, and it's not a natural competitive advantage that ought to be considered in trade. I mean, we're not trying to stop all trade. We're not naive about this globe and the way that it interacts with each other. But trade should not be the basis of your foreign policy program, and it shouldn't be based on exploitive methods in which you're either exploiting the people who are making the products that you're shipping back here. And the idea that a company who's been in the U.S. for 50 or 100 years has created some legacy, has a community that relies on that employer, and that's often the case. They then leave the country, they go make their stuff in Mexico, or they make it in Asia, and ship it right back to the place where they always were, and expect to enter that market now with this extremely cheap product. And we don't try and stop that. We think we don't have a right to step forward and say, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to take advantage of all that. And if those companies aren't here, they're not lending to the investment in infrastructure. They don't have the skin in the game that they ought to have, having access to this market, and in many cases having left it behind. So I think we need a government who understands that and understands the need to speak up to companies and say, this is not the Wild West. You're not going to do anything you want to do and leave people behind in the way that's happened in this country. Look, manufacturing used to be the biggest component of the country's GDP, and finance was a fraction of that, and it supported manufacturing. And we believe that if you're not making something, if you're not mining it, milling it, put some capital and labor against it, add value to it, and make a product and bring it to the market, that's where there's value. That's where you create jobs. You don't create value with a bunch of algorithms and Wall Street money manipulation, and that's not sustainable. And you can't just have a country that's running off of hospitality and restaurant systems. Somewhere you need to make something and sell it, and we're losing our ability to do that in this country, and it's something we ought to be very concerned about.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, your union represents some 850,000 men and women, and we can't have this conversation without talking about what they need in the middle of this pandemic. as Congress continues to design recovery plans, what do they need to do to protect the workers that you represent?
Look, I think a lot of workers, I mean, there's sort of two things going on. The pandemic has had some immediate effect and has shut down operations, and they will come back. And some of them pretty quickly, others not. But all that's happened here is not just solely a function of the COVID pandemic. There is also an underlying economic problem that's been going on in the country, and this sort of brought it to surface. And we see it in a lot of our basic materials and in manufacturing that is here. And I think we're in for a tough ride out of here. And people who say, well, you know, this recovery is going to snap right back, it's going to be a V-shaped recovery, I think that's very naive. And so people need to know what jobs are going to look like in the future. And there needs to be sort of a fundamental overhaul of America's kind of pay systems, a recognition of what people are doing. And that's going to be a big, big challenge. But I don't know how we say to workers, you're an essential worker, and we need you to go to work and take care of people and help heal them or transport them or show up in emergency systems and drive our ambulances, move our transportation systems, and we're going to pay you $10 an hour. It's just not a fair system. And so we fight and we squabble about trying to get to a $15 minimum wage, and you hear corporations and capital in this country scream like stuck pigs over something like that. But you're not going to have a country and a consumer-driven economy if you don't put money into it. And so, you know, what they've done so far to sort of bridge through the layoffs with the $600 has been helpful and has helped a lot of people. But you really do need to create jobs. And I think this is the time for America to do a massive investment in a jobs program with an infrastructure program. And there's ways to keep people safe at work. And we now understand what we need in terms of PPE, how social distancing will work, how we can make sure that there are safe workplaces. And in our union, we have safety committees who work with the management and deal with those issues in real time as they come up on a day-to-day basis, and deal with the fact that some people will contract this and some won't, and how do you deal with that in the factory. But besides just getting through the virus, getting through this economy and the need to fundamentally restructure the way America works, I think that's a big challenge ahead of us. But if we don't do it and we try and just go back to the way things were, you know, it's not solving a problem for us. So I think this is a time for the country to do something kind of really quantum leap, and we're going to have to spend our way out of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you know, there's the New Deal. I mean, that did something, you know, back in the 20th century, and perhaps
right.
It's a Green New Deal or some other sort of same sort of investment in the American workforce to get us back on the right track.
Look, back then they created the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA, and they tried a lot of other different things. Not every one of them worked, but you got to start trying. And so
right.
Here, there are a lot of things that we can do that can improve this nation and put it on a good path going forward for a long time, give people skills, give people an opportunity. You know, if you're a young person in America, or you're a millennial, I mean, think back about what's happened over their lifetime. You know, as young persons, we had 9/11 and what that did to the country. And about the time we're crawling out of that, hits the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. and dials it back again. And now, 10 years later, we've been hit with this virus, which has completely shut down our nation for 2 months. And so if you're 35, 40 years old, you've never had a chance to sort of get yourself established, to get on your feet, to get into a career and have a career path moving forward, because there's this trauma that keeps befalling the country. And there's a generation of people that we've got to reach out to and provide them an opportunity, because they are the future when this baby boom generation moves on. And we've got to give them a chance in this country. And if we won't invest in the country, I don't know how we can expect them to succeed.
Amen. Tom Conway, International President of the United Steelworkers Union, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Tom, we certainly appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back and talk more about this sometime down the road.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Once again, in the middle of this debate about the Second Amendment. You talk about it a lot in your book, Allow Me to Retort, Ellie. And I just want to read, as you put in your book, the exact wording of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. How do we get from there to the right of an 18-year-old to buy 2 assault rifles and walk into an elementary school and kill 19 kids and 2 teachers?
This is the result of the NRA, Bill. For the first 200 or so years of American history, the right to bear arms and the need to regulate those arms sales were not in conflict. Okay, there was no intellectual or legal space between the ideas that we needed gun regulation and safety laws and that we had a Second Amendment. Those two ideas coexisted for almost 200 years, for over 200 years of American history. But in the 70s, hardliners within the NRA kind of took over that organization. The gun nuts call it the revolt in Cincinnati. Hardliners took over that organization, which up until that time had been a relatively benign association of Bambi killers.
A sportsman, right? Basically. Duck hunters, deer hunters. Yeah.
And they essentially invented a new ad campaign that tied the Second Amendment to a nearly unfettered right to have weapons for self-defense. That idea was adopted by the Republican Party, kind of hook, line, and sinker. That idea was then adopted by Republican justices of a certain breed. Remember, it wasn't too long ago that Warren Burger in the 70s said that the NRA's interpretation of the Second Amendment was a fraud perpetrated on the American people. All right? But the Federalist Society, the group, the organization that gets to pick all of the Republican judges now, bought the NRA ad campaign. And so then we get to 2008 in a case called DC versus Heller.
Yep.
Where Justice Antonin Scalia makes up, for the first time in American history, a new right to bear arms specifically for the purposes of personal self-defense. Again, that never happened before. Scalia made it up in 2008. And that is why we are here. So now, even when we try to have gun regulations, those regulations are thought to be in conflict with the blood-soaked interpretation of the Second Amendment as promulgated by the NRA and conservative justices on the Supreme Court.
But this whole idea of self-defense, right, is bogus, isn't it? I mean,
from the founding perspective, it is completely bogus. So the idea behind, so let's go back to the founding. Let's go back to 1787. We're out there where we don't have we don't have Robitussin, we don't have cell phones, but we have slaveholding colonists and rich slaveholding white men who are designing a new government. Right, most of them are under 30 are in their 30s, I should say. They're designing a new government. They write the Constitution. They don't think, the authors of the Constitution do not think that the Constitution needs amendments, what we now call the Bill of Rights. They thought their document was fine. But a different group of generally slaveholding white men decided that they wanted the Constitution to specifically protect certain rights. That's how we got the Bill of Rights in the first place. Now, the argument for the Second Amendment was made by Patrick Henry, was made by George Mason, who was then governor of Virginia. They wanted the Second Amendment because they knew that the well-regulated militia was the best way for Southern states to put down slave revolts. That is not me being hyperbolic. That is what they said. They understood. Henry says that the North hates slavery. And if the federal government has the right to raise the militia, they might not raise it to put down slave revolts. You see, like, you gotta remember, Bill, it's difficult, right, to hold people in bondage against their will unless you have a numerical and military superiority over those people, right? So in certain pockets of the South, in certain parts of Virginia, in certain parts of South Carolina, the enslaved people outnumbered the white folks. And the way that they would put slave revolts down was to raise the state militia. Well, the Second Amendment gave the states, the individual, the right to raise the militia, not the federal government. And that's why they wanted it. That's why well-regulated militia is the first part of the Second Amendment. That's what they were thinking.
Right.
It had nothing to do with personal self-defense unless you count enslaved people trying to break free as self-defense for white folks.
So just like so much else in this country, as the book, The 1619 Project, outlines very, very powerfully, this whole idea of gun control their interpretation of the Second Amendment is rooted in racism. Still today, correct?
Absolutely. Look, the biggest gun control person was patron saint of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, in the 60s. Because in the 60s, the Black Panthers were arming themselves in California and going on what they called cop watching. Kind of trailing the police with loaded rifles, right? Oh, white folks in California didn't like that so much. And so Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, passed one of the more restrictive gun laws ever in this country. And again, now I can argue that gun law was racist. I can argue that it was racially biased, but I can't argue that it was in conflict with the Second Amendment. And in fact, no justice did argue that California gun restriction law was in conflict with the Second Amendment. Nobody did argue that the Munford Act was in conflict with the Second Amendment. So again, this current interpretation that the Second Amendment allows for an unfettered right to gun access, that was made up recently, more recently than, Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
More recently than Griswold v. Connecticut, the case that gives the right to contraception. More recently than Loving v. Virginia, the case that allows for interracial marriages. Those concepts have a longer history in our laws than the current Republican interpretation of the Second Amendment.
So is there, by the way, just as a tangent, as a Californian, I want to point out, Ronald Reagan also signed the biggest tax bill, hiking taxes, increasing in the history of California, too. A lot of people don't want to talk about that either. So is there anything we can do about it other than new members of the Supreme Court?
look, I'm always for new members of the Supreme Court. I'm always for changing the composition of that court because I do not perceive that anything good can survive 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Bill, understand, the Supreme Court is about to respond to the shootings in Texas, respond to the shootings in Buffalo, respond to whatever shootings happen between us recording this and this going live. The Supreme Court is about to respond to the epidemic of violence in this country by further liberalizing gun laws in a couple of weeks.
Right.
There's a case right now called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin that the Supreme Court took specifically to weaken New York State's gun permitting requirements and thereby weaken the gun permitting requirements of every state. They're basically going to try to turn New York and every other state into Texas. And they're going to release that opinion. It's going to, I believe, it's a prediction, but I believe that's going to be a 6-3 opinion with all 6 conservatives sticking together. I honestly believe if it wasn't for the Texas shooting, that decision would have come out on Tuesday. First decision day in June is when I thought that opinion was going to come out. Now, because of the shooting, they might try to hold it a couple of weeks and hope people forget. But what the Supreme Court this month or next month will make it even easier for people to get guns without not just without a background check, without even having to register for a permit to get those guns. The Supreme Court is going to do that. So when you say, like, what can we do beyond new justices, like even the laws we already have, the conservative justices are willing to take away. I can't imagine a new law that the conservative justices would let stand. You want to talk about background checks? You want to talk about an assault rifle ban? Those are great ideas. The Supreme Court won't let us have it. The unelected, unaccountable branch of government will not let us vote ourselves into a more safe union.
Right. And at this point, Republicans in the Senate will not even debate the issue, right, or vote on the issue, which is unlikely to change. As we speak, there's this period that's been sort of set aside now to see if Republicans and Democrats can get control and pass some kind of sensible gun safety legislation. What do you think the chances of that are?
I mean, I think McConnell is fooling people. I think this is a feint by McConnell. He's going to say that we tried. He's only going to propose something ridiculous that won't help at all. Mm-hmm. And Democrats won't go for it. And then McConnell can be like, we tried, but the Democrats are too liberal and extreme, and nothing will happen. McConnell's very smart about this. He understands that after every eruption of violence, there are calls for them to do something, and he understands that people lose focus if McConnell just waits on it, right? If he just does nothing for a couple of weeks, the media will move on, people will move on. We have accepted at some really disturbing level, people have accepted this violence as unavoidable. People have accepted dead children as a price to pay that's worth it because they want Republicans in power. That's what people have decided, and McConnell knows it. And McConnell knows that his best strategy is just to wait him out.
Oh, God, you're so right, and it's so sad. Just infuriating. Now, let's.
I mean, Bill, you have kids, right? Like I've got a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and
right.
It's I don't. It's difficult to process what other people are willing to let happen to my kids. Now, as a black father, I've dealt with this for a long time with the police. That people are they just view it as a price of living in America. My kids might get shot by the police or having Skittles at the wrong place at the wrong time. Like, the people just accept that my kids have to bear that cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now people also accept that all kids, not just black kids, but all kids have to bear the cost of school shootings for, again, an interpretive philosophy of the Second Amendment that didn't exist 50 years ago, for the gun lobby, for, my kids have to bear the cost of being shot because Smith & Wesson needs profit margins. Like it's insane to me that this is something that we've accepted, and we know that it's insane because nowhere else in the industrialized, economically wealthy world do people accept this. We are an outlier. No other country does what we do. No other country would stand for it.
And the idea that we have this mental health problem right in this country, that we're the only ones where we have people who have mental health problems or something. It is total.
Other countries have people with mental health problems. Other countries have disaffected male youths, right? Other countries have weak politicians and powerful special interests. Other countries do not have a high court that is willing to invalidate laws passed by the elected representatives based on a fringe and cultist theory.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.